Continuing on with Franklin Roosevelt's programs for immediate relief. The New Deal can be divided into two parts. Relief programs that basically give people food and create work when there isn't any. And the second part is to reform, to change the federal government. Of course, the first part also changed the federal government. So people have talked about this actually this morning on the news with the relief programs, which is what we're in the middle of now for the coronavirus. We're not at reform because the virus pandemic is not over yet, but we are trying to relieve the pain caused by the immediate virus, the medical problems, and the economic collapse connected with it. So we went through a number of the New Deal agencies, FERA, the NRA, the WPA, the CCC, and I'm talking about two of the biggest agencies here, which are the WPA and the AAA. WPA is one of the most famous agencies Roosevelt set up. It is the Works Progress Administration. The A is always administration or association, that's not a big deal, but works progress. Again, the goal is put people to work. Over the years, it's one of the longest lasting programs. It employed over 8 million, this is adults, not young men, but adults of all races. What did they do? They did some of the things that the PWA did. They did some small construction, they did conservation programs, but they were basically interested in, they're most famous for their arts programs, supporting things that never would have made a living at the time. They paid minimum wage. They also offered some college scholarships to people in college at the time. They built some of the same things the WPA did, parks, airports, sewers, conservation things, but are very famous for their arts programs. This is when we have the Federal Writers Program start, the Federal Dance Program, the Federal Arts Program, the Federal Theater Project. Remember, in the middle of the Depression, right after the Depression starts, nobody's going to see a movie theater. You don't even have the dime for the movie theater. Nobody's going to go see a dance performance. Nobody's going to go see a concert. Nobody's going to buy a painting. They can't buy food. So what this program was designed to do was to employ people who would not be employed otherwise, who are immediately hit by the Depression. All artists, by definition, are unemployed at the time. So they hired people at a very low wage, but a living wage, to basically do what they did, to either put on plays. Theater companies were hired to go around to small towns and perform plays, which for many small towns was the only time anybody had ever seen a theater performance or seen Shakespeare. They hired writers to write books, to write state guides, which we still have. If you go down next to the Capitol, there's a little building there and you can get the guide to the state of Texas, which lists every town in Texas and has some nice pictures in it, which is updated annually. To collect historical records, to collect regional folk music, to offer local art classes, to paint public murals on the sides of buildings, and particularly in post offices. If you go to small towns in Texas today and look at the walls of their small town post offices, a lot of those murals, those decorations, were made during the Depression by the WPA. Community orchestras put on orchestra and band performances. Again, small towns had never seen this. Historical preservation, try to redo historical buildings, sometimes even teachers. This is the first time many Americans have ever been exposed to any of this. 30 million people saw WPA plays that were put on. Another program they had, of course, because many teachers are unemployed, was literacy, and the WPA taught over 2 million people, many of them African Americans, literacy, how to read. Another famous thing they did was go into the Deep South and collect the stories of African Americans who had been born and raised under slavery. So some of the only first-hand accounts we have of slavery are from the WPA collections. Otherwise, those stories would have been lost. Another thing they did very famous for is photography, because nobody's taking photographs during the Great Depression. You don't have your family picture done. So the Farm Security Administration paid photographers, including some very famous ones, to go out and document the Depression. These photographs were shown in the media, shown in Congress. People became aware of how horrible the Depression was, particularly on the Great Plains, from over 200,000 photographs from these groups of photographers who went out. They also made films. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which was a bestseller about the Okies moving to California, was printed in 1939. 1940, they made a movie about it. And the director was afraid that all the horrible things in the book really propaganda, that Steinbeck was trying to get more sympathy for the farm workers. So he hired detectives to go out to the fields in California and find out what was really going on. They found, just like Teddy Roosevelt's guys found, that it's really worse than what he wrote about in the book. So the question with this is, if the government pays for it, is it by definition propaganda? And that's something you have to answer for yourselves. They did documentary films that were distributed free to private theaters. Look at what is funded today and how it's funded. In England, the BBC is government funded. Is it propaganda? I would think one of the criteria would be how much control the government has over it. In Russia, of course, if the government funds it, we know the media is controlled by the government. In America, who funds PBS and NPR? Private donations, so the government has no influence. This is a point in American history where the government funded media, paid for it. On the other hand, from what we know, they had almost no control over it. They didn't tell people what to photograph and what to publish. So yes and no, you have to decide for yourself how much government interference is involved with it. The other major program that came out of the relief agencies was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. Agriculture was in serious trouble, not only on the plains, but nationwide. It was a nationwide drought, 10 years on the plains, and Franklin Roosevelt is quite aware, and I'm quoting, unless something is done for the American farmer, there will be a revolution in the countryside in less than a year. If you can't feed people, there will be violence. And that directly relates to what's going on today with the coronavirus. Okay. So an agency was set up to try and solve the problems of agriculture. One of the first things they did was send out agricultural agents and soil conservation agents trying to teach people better methods of farming, which you saw in the film on the Dust Bowl. How to plow deeply, how to follow the lines of the land rather than plowing vertically uphill and have everything run off, how to not turn over the soil until right before you're ready to plant, because at least the remainder of the crops keep the soil from blowing away. The government also bought out drought lands, particularly on the southern plains. They regrassed them, turned them into grasslands, which are government land today. 4 million acres was regrassed. They turned some into state and local parks. By the end of the 1930s, the storms were actually decreasing. The dust storms had started to decrease because there was less open land. They had regrassed the plains, a lot of the plains. The most controversial part of the Agricultural Adjustment Agency was, for the first time, the government came in and told farmers not to plant. You are being paid not to produce, but to not produce, not to plant their fields. From what I know, this was mandatory. Government agents were sent out across the country. They examined each farmer and they told him, okay, this is what you can plant. If you had 500 acres last year, you're going to plant 200 acres this year. Okay? Talking about government control, how much government control is communism, how much is socialism, how much is capitalism. This is pretty serious government control. They came in and told you this is what you will, how much you will plant on your land. They didn't tell you what to plant, but how much, how many acres. Unfortunately, the first year they do this, it's late spring. It was April when they really started this program. So many farmers had already planted. There were 10 million acres of cotton already planted. People had already had baby cattle, baby pigs, baby chickens. What happened is agricultural agents came in and said, okay, you cannot raise 200 piglets this year. You can only raise 100. So what happens to the other 100? You have to take them out and slaughter them. This is pretty traumatic for farmers and ranchers to slaughter baby animals that they have spent generations building up their herds. What is the purpose of this? Why are you slaughtering animals? Why are you dumping milk at the same time there's a food shortage in the country? The goal is to save agriculture, to get prices up so farmers could make a decent living. It worked. Within a year, agricultural prices had gone up again. Farmers were actually surviving. They could make a living on their farms, but it was incredibly traumatic and people didn't understand it. Again, supply and demand. If you reduce the supply, the demand is still there, the price will go up. Immediate results. Within a few years, not only are farmers back in business, half of the eroded land had been reversed. There are a much lower percentage of dust storms than there were. Farm income almost doubled. Corn went from 3 cents a bushel, not worth even planting, to 10 cents a bushel, and by 1940, 70 cents a bushel. It finally rained in 1940, and the drought was over. The agricultural disaster was over. The other side effect of this, though, is it gives money to farmers not to plant. It gives money to farmers who own their land. What about the millions, 3 million tenant farmers who did not own their land but were sharecroppers or renting their land? If you are planting half of what you planted last year, you don't need those guys. They have nothing to do. They basically left the land. And this is where a lot of Okies and also Arkies from Arkansas ended up in California. They had nothing. They had the drought, and on top of that, if they rented their land or were sharecroppers, they were no longer needed. The wages for farm laborers decreased because now there's a surplus of farm laborers. So this program did work for farmers in general. If you look at the slides, they are the end of that New Deal program slides, 40, 41. It hurt those who rented their land, but helped those. And we still have this today. We pay people not to plant, and we have a subsidy, particularly for dairy farmers and for crops. The government will guarantee that milk doesn't go below, let's say, $1 a gallon, that a dairy farmer will always get $1 a gallon for milk. Why do we need that? Because otherwise, a lot of them would go out of business and we wouldn't have milk. So this is a national necessity, and the government guarantees farmers a basic price. And this comes straight out of the Great Depression. Okay, so we have the programs that were set in place. Now we'll talk about issues that Roosevelt had, challenges to the New Deal. Stay safe out there.